The liberal hotel clerk folded his arms and mocked Donald Trump, but just seconds later, his face went pale as he realized Donald Trump was the new owner. The grand lobby of the Waldorf Astoria, New York exuded a quiet elegance, an air of solemnity that set it apart from the bustling, noisy hotels where the chatter of guests and the clinking of glass disrupted the atmosphere. Everything at the Waldorf Astoria operated with meticulous precision. The reception staff stood with perfect posture, their smiles polite but never overly warm. The hotel manager observed from a distance, ensuring that every step, every gesture of the employees adhered to the standards of professionalism. Here, every guest was someone of significance: CEOs, politicians, celebrities, names that held global influence. They didn't need to boast or make their presence known. A single glance was enough to confirm that they belonged to this world. But tonight, an unexpected man stepped in. The hotel's massive revolving door shifted slightly. A man entered the lobby, unaccompanied, with no one to hold the door for him. He didn't need them to. Dressed in a navy blue suit with no tie, his polished leather shoes gleamed subtly, exuding understated refinement. His stride was confident yet not arrogant. His blonde hair, slightly tousled, remained unmistakable. Donald Trump. And as he moved further into the room, some people recognized him. Immediately. Not all. Some guests merely glanced at him briefly, perhaps unwilling to acknowledge his presence. But Jake, the receptionist behind the front desk, saw him the moment he walked in. And rather than the nervous excitement most people might feel upon seeing a former U.S. president, Jake felt only disdain. He had read hundreds of articles, watched hundreds of news segments about Trump. He knew exactly who the man was. Or at least he believed he did. To Jake, Trump was the embodiment of everything he despised. A privileged billionaire, a conservative politician, a relic of a bygone era. And now, here he was, standing at the very reception desk where Jake worked. What the hell is this guy doing here? Jake thought, his fingers tightening slightly over the keyboard. Probably trying to get a free room or something. He glanced at the clock on his screen. This was his moment. He would not serve Donald Trump. Trump approached the front desk, placing a hand on the marble counter. Jake didn't greet him as he normally would. Instead, he simply stared at him with an expressionless face, as if Trump were just another unremarkable walk-in guest. "Good evening, Jake," said, his tone deliberately indifferent. Trump gave a slight nod, his piercing blue eyes scanning Jake with quiet scrutiny. "I have a reservation under my name," he said, his voice calm, steady, carrying an unmistakable weight. "Donald Trump." Jake deliberately let the silence linger, as if the name meant nothing to him. Then, inhaling slowly, he tapped a few keys, pretending to search for the booking. In reality, he already knew whether Trump had a reservation. But he wanted to make it clear, Trump was not welcome here. After a few moments of feigned searching, Jake looked up, a hint of a smirk playing on his lips. "Apologies, but the hotel is fully booked." For a few seconds, the air in the room seemed to shift. Trump slowly tilted his head, assessing Jake the way he might size up an opponent in a high-stakes negotiation. "Fully booked." He repeated each word with deliberate precision, his sharp gaze locked onto Jake. Jake crossed his arms over his chest, his shoulders lifting slightly in defiance. "Yes," he said firmly, without the slightest hesitation. "I'm afraid you'll have to find accommodations elsewhere." Silence. Trump took a quiet breath, then a subtle smile flickered at the corners of his lips, a smile that made Jake feel, for the first time, that something wasn't quite right. From across the lobby, Martha, a longtime hotel employee, stiffened slightly. She knew that look in Trump's eyes all too well. It wasn't the look of a man who had just been slighted. It was the look of a man who had just spotted a mistake, and knew exactly how to exploit it. Jake, still unaware that he had just stepped onto a minefield, continued to assert his position. "The Waldorf Astoria has very high standards," he said, deliberately raising his voice. "We want to ensure the atmosphere is right for our special guests." Trump tilted his head slightly, as if considering something. Then he took out his phone. He dialed a number quickly. The other end picked up immediately. His voice dropped to a calm, deliberate pace, but each word carried undeniable weight. "Alan, bring the ownership papers of Waldorf Astoria down to the lobby right now." The air in the lobby shifted instantly. A few guests nearby turned to look, unsure whether they had heard correctly. Martha held her breath. Jake began to sense something was off, but he still tried to keep his composure. Are you joking?" Jake asked, but his tone was no longer as confident as before. Trump slipped the phone into his pocket, his gaze never leaving Jake. "You think so?" he asked softly. Jake choked on his words, realizing he was on shaky ground. Moments later, the ting of the elevator echoed in the tense atmosphere. Jake swallowed hard. A middle-aged man stepped out, exuding authority, carrying a leather-bound folder. He walked calmly toward the front desk, nodding at Trump with utmost respect. Jake's stomach dropped. It was Alan Weisselberg, the former CFO of the Trump Organization. A man he never expected to meet face-to-face, especially not under these circumstances. Weisselberg placed the thick file on the marble counter. His fingers gently brushed across the leather cover, as though preparing for a revelation that could shake the room. Jake struggled to swallow, his mouth dry. Trump folded his arms, tilting his head as he looked at Jake, his voice as calm as ever, but now carrying a chilling tone. "Do you know what Alan has in his hands?" Jake didn't answer. He couldn't. People around them began to gather. A few employees quietly approached, and curious guests glanced from a distance. The entire lobby now seemed to focus on one point, the standoff between Trump and Jake. Alan opened the file, pushing a page forward. "This is the ownership document for Waldorf Astoria," he said slowly. "Signed exactly 6 months ago." The lobby fell silent. Jake's face went pale. Trump leaned forward against the front desk, bracing himself with both hands. No more smiles. No more contemplative looks. Only an undeniable truth. "You didn't just refuse to serve a guest," Trump said, his voice low but as clear and hard as a hammer falling in a courtroom. He paused, his gaze piercing through Jake. "You just refused to serve your boss." Jake froze completely. Martha's mouth hung open. Some of the longtime employees could only stare at each other, unable to believe what they were hearing. A few guests whispered. An older man, possibly a politician, raised an eyebrow as though witnessing an unforgettable lesson in power. Jake felt the blood freeze in his veins. He had just refused to serve a guest. No, not just any guest. He had just refused his own boss. The lobby was engulfed in heavy silence. The guests, once preoccupied with their own worlds, were now fully focused on this confrontation. Trump remained standing there, his calm gaze as sharp as a knife. Martha stood behind the counter, her hands clenched, knowing the storm was about to hit. Jake gritted his teeth, trying to stay composed. He couldn't admit he was wrong, not now. "No, this can't be happening. He's just putting on a show." He took a deep breath, stepped forward, his voice trembling slightly but still defiant. "You may own this hotel," he said, his tone challenging. "But that doesn't mean I have to serve you." The lobby was in shock. A few employees stared wide-eyed. One guest almost choked on their drink. But Trump showed no sign of surprise. On the contrary, a faint smile flickered on his lips. He leaned forward on the counter, his voice lowering with authority. "Interesting," Trump said slowly. "You just said you don't have to serve me?" Jake swallowed, but still clung to his pride. "That's right," he replied firmly. "This is America, right? I have the right to choose." Martha took a deep breath, sensing a nightmare unfolding before her eyes. Trump tilted his head, as though considering something. Then he nodded slightly. "You're right," he agreed. "You do have the right to choose." Jake felt a spark of victory. He thought he had just stood his ground. But then, Trump continued. "But do you know what else is true?" He paused, letting the silence hang in the air, making it heavier than ever. Jake felt the pressure bearing down on his chest. Trump raised an eyebrow. "I have the right to choose as well." A moment of silence. Then he straightened up, his voice clear, reverberating throughout the hotel lobby. "And I have the right to choose who deserves to work in my hotel." Jake froze. He could feel every eye on him. This was the moment of judgment. He had misjudged the situation. He had gone too far. And now he was just one step away from losing everything. Martha watched Jake tensely, knowing he had to make a decision right then and there. Jake opened his mouth, but couldn't find the words. His whole body was trembling. He was wrong. But admitting it meant giving up everything he had ever believed in. He couldn't do it? Jake took a deep breath, but his chest still felt heavy. Everything seemed to be collapsing around him. But at that moment, Trump exhaled lightly and shook his head. Not in anger. Not in triumph. Just a slight, gentle disappointment. "Kid," he said, his voice no longer sharp. "You think you know everything. But the truth is, you don't understand anything." Jake suddenly felt a lump in his throat. The way Trump said it, it didn't feel like a boss firing an employee. It felt like an older man looking at a young man and seeing himself in him. Jake didn't understand why his eyes were welling up. Trump sighed, folding his arms across his chest. "But I'm not the kind of person who likes to take opportunities away from others," he said, his tone slow and deliberate. "I've made many mistakes in my life, and I've learned from them." He paused, looking at Jake once more. "The question is, do you want to learn?" Jake was completely silent. Inside him, something was breaking, not his pride, but the prejudices he had held for so long. Trump was not the man he thought he was. Jake opened his mouth but closed it again. His gaze dropped, his eyes wavering between self-respect and an awakening. Trump turned to Martha, who had been quietly observing. "Martha," he said, "how long have you worked here?" 30 years, sir," she replied instantly, without hesitation. Trump nodded. "Can you teach him what real service is?" Martha's eyes widened, not expecting to play such an important role. But then she nodded gently. "I can," she said, her voice confident. Trump turned back to Jake. And now the entire hotel watched every movement Jake made. Trump said nothing more. No pressure. Just a choice left. One path. And Jake had to decide whether to walk down it or not. The silence weighed heavily on his shoulders, as if the whole world was waiting for his answer. Trump said nothing further. He simply stared at Jake, allowing him to face the consequences of his own actions. Jake swallowed, his mind spinning. I could walk away. I could find another job, somewhere without him, somewhere no one will remember my mistake. But then he glanced at Martha. She wasn't scolding, nor judging him. It was just a look of anticipation, as if she wanted to say, "This is your opportunity. Do the right thing." Jake took a deep breath and slowly lifted his head to look at Trump. He had made his decision. Jake's voice trembled. He had never felt so small before. All the eyes were on him, but he knew that only one person truly mattered in that moment. Jake took another deep breath and slowly spoke. "I want to stay. I want to learn." Trump tilted his head slightly, as if evaluating the words. Martha gave a faint smile. A second of silence passed. Then, Trump nodded. Wise choice. He glanced at Martha and then turned back to Jake. "She'll help you understand what you forgot tonight." Jake swallowed hard. He didn't need anyone to say more. He knew he was wrong, and he knew what he had to do next. Martha placed a gentle hand on Jake's shoulder, saying nothing, but Jake felt a slight sense of relief. The entire hotel seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. A few guests started clapping, not because Donald Trump was a billionaire, but because a lesson had been taught right before their eyes. Trump turned and walked toward the elevator. Another employee quickly rushed up, bowing slightly. "Mr. Trump, we have a VIP room prepared for you. Let me—" Trump waved his hand. "No need," he said softly. "I just wanted to make sure this hotel still operates in the spirit it's meant to." The elevator doors closed. In the lobby, the murmurs persisted, but Jake stood still, because he knew, tonight, he had learned the most important lesson of his life. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the large windows of the Waldorf Astoria lobby, casting a strange, sparkling light on the crystal chandeliers. Jake stood behind the front desk, feeling like a stranger in his own job. He was no longer the arrogant receptionist he had been the day before. There was no sense of control. No longer the self-important notion that he had the right to judge guests. Instead, Jake felt small and fragile. Last night, he had been humiliated in front of the entire hotel. But he was still standing here today, because Donald Trump had given him a second chance. And now, the person responsible for training him was Martha. Martha approached, holding an old, well-worn notebook in her hands, her sharp gaze as if preparing to quiz a lazy student. She placed the notebook on the counter and folded her arms. "Jake," she said, her voice devoid of any pity. "Starting today, I will teach you about true hospitality." Jake swallowed nervously. He still felt anger and frustration about what had happened the night before. Why do I have to do this? But then, Martha's gaze made him unable to argue. Martha pointed to an elderly couple who had just entered the hotel lobby. "Go greet them," she said. Jake hesitated. He didn't understand. "They've already made a reservation," he said, confused. "They can check in themselves." Martha looked Jake in the eye, and for the first time, her voice became stern. "Do you think your job is just about entering information into the system and handing over room keys?" Jake didn't know how to respond. Martha smiled faintly, but it wasn't a smile of leniency. "The first thing you need to understand, Jake, is that hospitality isn't a choice. It's the essence of this job." Jake stared at her, unsure if he truly understood that. But he took a breath, adjusted his tie, and walked over to greet the elderly couple. "Good morning, sir and madam," Jake said, forcing a smile. The elderly man nodded lightly, but the woman beside him squinted at Jake. "You're the one from yesterday," the woman said, her voice cold. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Clearly, they had witnessed the entire incident. Jake didn't know what to say, but he could feel Martha's gaze on him from a distance. Instead of defending himself, Jake took a deep breath, bowed his head slightly, and said, "Yes, ma'am. And I hope I can do better today." The woman stared at Jake for a long moment. Then she gave a slight nod. "Then can you help me with my luggage?" Jake didn't hesitate. He bowed his head, picked up their suitcase, and led them to the front desk. Martha stood off to the side, observing Jake's every move. She saw his confusion, his fear. But more importantly, she saw that he had chosen to continue. She gave a slight nod. Jake still had a long way to go. But at least he had taken the first steps. 2 years passed. Jake was no longer the arrogant receptionist he once was. Now, he stood behind the front desk as the hotel manager of the Waldorf Astoria, his suit sharp, his demeanor calm, his eyes keen but filled with understanding. Martha had retired, but she always said Jake was the most deserving successor for the position. He no longer judged guests based on their clothes, politics, or wealth. Jake understood the true value of hospitality, making every guest feel important, not because of their status, but because they were human. One Friday evening, a man walked into the hotel. A navy blue suit. No tie. His signature blonde hair. Jake immediately recognized Donald Trump. But this time, he didn't freeze, nor did he feel discomfort. Instead, Jake stepped forward, offering a professional smile and a slight bow. "Welcome back, Mr. Trump," he said. "I've prepared a room for you." Trump studied Jake for a moment, then gave a slight nod, a satisfied smile crossing his face. "Good job, kid." And for the first time in 2 years, Jake truly understood the meaning of the word class. Jake's story reminds us of a profound lesson about humanity. Class isn't found in money or status. It's not shown through expensive clothes or political views. True class lies in how we treat others. And if someone like Jake, a once arrogant receptionist, full of prejudice, can learn, change, and become a leader who listens, then anyone can. But remember, not everyone gets a second chance. Many people make mistakes they never get to correct. They are discarded, forgotten. Are you sure you'll always have the chance to change? Think about how you treat others. Think about the invisible biases you might be holding inside. And remember that even a small mistake can destroy everything, if you're not willing to learn from it. If you found this story engaging, stay tuned for more stories filled with emotion and profound lessons about people, society, and decisions that can change lives. Have you ever been misjudged? Have you ever made a decision that you later regretted? Share in the comments. Thank you for following the story. We wish you the wisdom and compassion to make the right decisions in life. This content was compiled and rewritten with the support of AI and is not real, not representing any individual or organization. Any resemblance to actual events is purely coincidental.